Thank you, Mr. Rudd, for joining us.
Good to be with you in these very difficult times, particularly for all company directors across Australia.
They are very, very difficult. Where are you at the moment? Are you at home in Brisbane?
I came back from the United States about 2 weeks ago, and we're at Peregian on the Sunshine Coast, which is basically where I grew up. So I'm here with my family.
It's good to know that you're safe and healthy at home in Queensland. So this crisis is a test of leadership from the national level to business. We've seen it with sporting organisations. It will hit just about every type of business. It'll hit NFPs as well and charities. What would your advice be to leaders making difficult decisions right now?
Well, I think there are probably a couple of core principles here in any crisis. The first is to think through very carefully what your triage strategy is to get through the 3 to 6 months ahead. And secondly, to have in planning process the rebuild strategy as well. Easy to say both those things, very hard to do, but I think in internal corporate planning, it's very important to have those two parts of your brain working simultaneously on those interrelated but quite different challenges. I'm also mindful in saying that company directors across Australia are faced with a whole series of very difficult choices right now. One is cash flow. 2, what to do with your staff. 3, what's your relationship like with your banks and your extension of credit. 4, how can I access government programs, both in terms of staff support and the continuation of the wages you pay to staff and salaries. At the same time, what government programs exist in terms of supporting banks to provide your company with lines of credit. So I understand a fair bit, the deep amount of stress that this all imposes on the headspace and the emotional space of people in leadership positions. But I think if you maintain this approach of seeing the unfolding realities in 2 boxes, triage for 6 months, 3 to 6 months, and recovery in the post 6 month period. And I think if you do that effectively, you'll navigate your way through.
Looking at that triage time at the moment, taking us back, maybe you can take us back to 2008 and talk us through what you did back then. You were getting advice on very complex issues then, the types of issues that we're dealing with at the moment and that organisations are dealing with now. Information is coming in from all sides. It's changing by the day, sometimes almost by the hour. Back in 2008, how did you process all of that information so that you could make quick, decisive decisions?
Well, in 2008-9, we had one advantage that we'd put in a lot of work over the previous 9 months preparing for this contingency. When I first raised the possibility with the Secretary of the Treasury that we may face systemic problems. So when Lehman's went under in September of 2008, our framework for analysis was fairly clear. 1, what do you do in terms of immediate economic stimulus by fiscal and monetary policy? 2, what do you do with the downstream employment effect where those fiscal interventions would not work? And 3, what's our calibrated set of international actions? Because if we stimulated the hell out of the Australian economy, but no one else did anything else around the world, well, frankly, it's just not going to work. Those, I think, are useful conceptual approaches. I think the other thing I'd say is that is very difficult, either running a government or running a corporation, large or small, to suffer from information overload. That's why I strongly recommend people put their decision-making into manageable, bite-sized boxes in order to, and put each of those boxes into an overall matrix for decision-making. Otherwise, people get what I just describe as paralysis by information overload. So for us in the government, It was being clear about each of those elements of the decisions which need to be taken: fiscal policy, monetary policy, global action, as well as local employment action. And what were the subcomponents of those? Secondly, most critically, communication strategy to make sure the rest of the country, the community and the business community knew what the hell we were doing and why. And thirdly, to have what I would describe as an effective overarching narrative, which is not Pollyanna bullshit, but says, here's the problem, here's our analysis of it, this is what we're doing about it and why, and these are the effects we believe it will have in militating against the crisis we face. In the current crisis, obviously, public health, as well as the real economy.
I did want to ask you about communication. We're seeing the importance of that right now. A lot of the decisions that are being made are complex. Governments, businesses, they're relying on complex advice as well. If you're a government or if you're a business, how do you make sure that your communication with stakeholders is effective in a situation like this?
I think the first principle is to make sure that it is consistent. Second, that it is clear so that the layperson can understand. And third, it's repeated and updated on a regular basis. I think it's useful, for example, to put out notifications with a number. Company X, notification number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, so people understand that this forms part of a logical sequence. Similarly for government. I think one of the problems at present being experienced by the Morrison government is that with these plethora of press conferences by the Prime Minister, by the Treasurer, by the Health Minister, by the Chief Medical Officer, and by the Premiers and the State Health Ministers, is that people in the general community are suffering from information overload and confusion. So my recommendation to the government, which I've already communicated to them, is that each day in the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, there is a consolidation of the core message. And it's got to pass the KISS principle, keep it simple, stupid. And that on any complexity, there is a link to not just a more detailed website, but to real live human beings who are going to actually police those programs and implement them. That would be my recommendation of dealing with an effective communication strategy in a crisis.
Moving out now to that, hopefully 6-month period, say, where we're looking to the other side, looking to recovery. Where are we going at the moment, and how do organisations prepare for that world on the other side?
Look, I understand the complexity of that question. I think a realistic timing framework for the analysis of this is based on the information I have available to me, is look towards a 3-month intense period of significant direct disruption from the manifestation of the virus itself in people's workplaces and communities, and its impact, therefore, on workforces, as well as on demand and your ability to reopen your business. And then what I see, if I'm looking into the future, is a 3-month period which takes us into and through the third quarter this year of graduated recovery to economic normality. I think, as I said before, each of those disciplines is different in terms of how you approach the tasks associated with each of them. My advice to the government has been for many weeks now, is to understand, and I've written this in various opinion pieces I've done for The Guardian, on my own website, and in Facebook communications, is the central economic task for the period ahead for the government is to keep businesses afloat until we are through the immediate crisis. The alternative is simply to throw them to the wolves with huge consequences for good businesses for whom this crisis is not at all attributable to their blame. But by throwing them to the wolves, you're also throwing to the wolves literally millions of Australian jobs. So the government part in triage, either by way of wage subsidy, as I've argued consistently, or by way of credit lines of support, or by way with largest firms, even the government, through extending direct credit to firms taking equity temporarily in those firms, as the United States government did under the TARP program for financial institutions in the United States in the 08-09 crisis. They, I believe, are the central tasks of government, working with businesses large, medium and small.
I guess as well as part of that, we can start thinking about 3 to 6 months now on the recovery side, but there is also some pretty severe downside scenarios that we need to be thinking about as well. Some of them might be unimaginable, but you need to think through the unimaginable right now. How do you get into the headspace where you can start to think about some of the darkest scenarios that we might face as a country, or that businesses large and small might face? How should they be doing that sort of downside scenario planning right now?
Our approach as a government during the financial crisis of 08-09, which frankly led into 10 as well. This was not a short process. It's when my hair turned white, by the way. It was through sheer lack of sleep, partly because in dealing with the global financial crisis, we're dealing with time zones which are not sympathetic to Australian realities. So I found myself constantly on the phone to heads of government and heads of treasuries and central banks around the world into the dead of the night here in Australia. But we came through. Therefore, personal resilience at that level in terms of the leader is quite important. Similarly for corporations. On the core element of your question, I think it's very important to manage your own headspace through this. We are working at present, I believe, through what I describe as a reasonable, rational scenario in terms of a 3 to 6 month period along the lines that I've just been talking about and Mr. Morrison's been talking about. 2 to 3 months of intense, let's call it medical emergency, 2 to 3 months of partial economic recovery before return to normality. Of course, in terms of your headspace, it's important to have, let's call it, worst case scenario planning as well. But I think that's worth considering in a different headspace and a different box of tools, frankly, that you would then make recourse to. That's important to have that there as part of your intellectual software and frankly your emotional software as you navigate a crisis. But consider them again in 2 separate boxes.
Yeah, that sort of self-care is important for everybody now. It's not just leaders, it's all Australians and everyone around the world. We're getting all of this information all the time. Lots of people are anxious and scared. We're making decisions at every level. Parents are making decisions about their children.
Fear is a deeply disabling emotion. It can produce paralysis. It can also produce anger and hatred. The challenge of political leadership at a time like this, as I found it during the global financial crisis, was to say repeatedly, each day to the country, until they got sick of me saying it, guys and girls, we're all in this together. Every one of us, largest corporations, small businesses, you the trade unions, you the state and local governments of the country. Together, with a coherent strategy, we can navigate this. Let me tell you, apart, falling into separate warring tribes, we won't. And so therefore, that provides what I describe as a rational basis for optimism, causing, not through Pollyanna-ish statements, not what FDR used to describe during the Great Depression as the ballyhoo school of politics, which is, I can ballyhoo you into feeling better about what's going on. That's just bullshit. What I'm talking about is a rational basis for optimism, which is anchored in a clear analysis of the problem, public health, as well as public economic policy. Secondly, a clear articulation of the policy measures being taken in sequence with a rationale for each of them, as well as a collective rationale about return to normality. And thirdly, as I said, a clear communication strategy. Now, that provides people, as I said before, with a rational basis for hope. The alternative is to cheer up, everybody, it'll be fine in the morning. Well, Australians are a pretty pragmatic lot. In my experience, that's never really worked with them, nor should it, because there are real things here to be really concerned about. The third approach is simply, frankly, to allow people's most negative animal spirits to take over, and then concern becoming anxiety, becoming fear, becoming anger, becoming hatred, and above all, producing nothing positive, but in fact, possibly inducing irrational behavior or even worse, paralysis. So I think, therefore, a rational basis for optimism can be constructed even through these most dire of crises.
I want to look far out the other side now. We've talked about the short term, the medium term. I'm wondering now, a crisis like this changes society, it changes the world, it could change relationships between the great powers as well. And we're seeing that at the moment with the bickering between the United States and China. It's not a great time for this crisis to hit, but what sort of world do you see on the other side, Mr. Rudd?
But you know something, the world that has delivered us this crisis is a highly globalized world. It's delivered us this crisis for two reasons. One, the interconnectedness of public health across national jurisdictions. And second, it's delivered us this crisis because of the interconnectedness of our economy through trade, through investment flows, and of course, through the seamless global capital markets, which Australian banks, for example, are drawing upon each day. So the central policy challenge, as I see it, for national leaders coming out of this crisis is how do we rebuild the fabric of a manageable form of global governance. It's one of the reasons I've been campaigning for a month now for the G20 to be convened. I'm pleased that's going to happen in the next 24 hours or so. Our immediate problem has been an American administration under Donald Trump, not faintly interested in global governance, but only interested in, quote, America first. Now, we'll see what happens at the upcoming US presidential elections, but it's in Australia's interest and the interests of our principal friends and allies in the world, in Asia, in Europe, and elsewhere, to reconstitute the fabric of a manageable form of global governance, both on public health and on global economic management. We sought to construct that through the G20, the Financial Stability Board, and the reconstituted membership of the Basel Committee to handle public finance questions. And those institutions are working very hard at this. On public health, I frankly think very few of the reform recommendations which have been made over the course of the last decade have been adhered to. I chaired myself a reform of the UN system about 2 to 3 years ago, including an entire document of recommended reforms to the World Health Organization. Going back into Australian recent history, at the 2020 summit held more than a decade ago, we also convened panels dealing with public health. And the recommendations of that panel dealing with Australia's management of global pandemics is there and clear for all to see. Now, the question is, given this massive warning shot being fired across all of our bows at the moment, do we have the collective political wit, wisdom, and leadership of a transpartisan and transnational basis to reconstitute the fabric of effective global governance? Because in the end of the day, no man is an island. At the end of the day, effective global responses are not just an exotic and useful thing to do. They are, in fact, essential. That is, global action is essential to the success of effective national action. Without it, it doesn't work. So that, I think, is our central challenge, looking into the medium to long term.
I did read the 2020 report today, the part of it on pandemics, and it is prescient. I mean, there's a lot of talk about how the governments across Australia would cooperate at that time and the regional implications as well. So yeah, it is worth, I recommend that to our listeners. It's worth.
Well, it's important that people go to the website and look at it, because these were reflections which were tabled in 2009. Various actions were taken on that basis, and various things were not prosecuted, shall I say, after 2013. But I don't intend to have any partisan debate here. It's not the time for that. But the national deep learning, I would hope, from this crisis, as from the previous crisis, is to use effectively and continue to reform and improve the institutions of global governance. Any retreat to simple nativism and nationalism, and frankly even racism, might make for a great piece of retail politics, but it also makes for lousy public policy in delivering real solutions to real problems, which every business and every worker and every household in Australia is now staring at directly through the window.
This is my final question, Mr. Rudd. Thank you for being so generous with your time. I'm just wondering if you had one message to give to the directors of Australia who are overseeing their organisations at a time of great uncertainty and crisis, what would that message be?
Look, to be fair to Mr. Morrison, and I have many political and policy disagreements with him in general policy terms, but also in some of the responses to this crisis. But in fairness to Mr. Morrison, he's under enormous pressure. We need to be mindful of that. And his cabinet ministers are under enormous pressure as well. Therefore, what is very useful if you're in government at a time like this is to receive a deeply considered proposal about what to do in terms of various sectors of the economy. Let me give you an example. In the last financial crisis, I remember sitting down with the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry at an awards dinner, would you believe, as the entire world was coming down around our ears. And those guys, literally on the back of an envelope, explained to me what a temporary investment allowance could look like for the Australian business community seeking to navigate the financial crisis which was unfolding. Now, my interest was how do I keep businesses afloat, particularly those providing industrial inputs to firms, whether they're photocopiers or, forklifts or God knows whatever else. And so they gave me a proposal, which I then took back to the Strategic Policy Committee of the Cabinet. The truth is the Treasury hated it, but it made sense to me. I wanted to bring forward investment activity into the cycle in order to have businesses with a further opportunity to be optimistic about their future. In the analysis of that particular measure a decade later by, I think, the Reserve Bank of Australia, it's now regarded as one of the most successful of all the measures that we took in order to keep Australia out of recession back then. So what's the message, therefore, to corporate leadership? Whether it's through the AICD, through the BCA, or through ACCI, or through the principal business institutions, developing a clear-cut policy